pilot error? Or is there something more sinister? Seemingly every day we tend to hear about small airplane crashes. And we looked at the statistics. There are some real surprises. So you really want to stick with us until the very end as we reveal them.
This is aviation, intrigue.
So even though we're seeing in the news just about every day that there's a small aircraft crash somewhere in the country, it does take a long time to get to the answers, the causes, and the statistics. So, as an example of the latest information we could find, we looked at a 10-year block from 2012 to 2021 of general aviation reports from the National Transportation Safety Board, which tracks and investigates and gathers data on all these accidents. And that sounds like that's probably the latest we can find for the reports that are completed with a probable cause.
Yeah, so in the US, the NTSB, or the National Transportation Safety Board, is the authority for collecting all this report and investigating. And it's not unusual. I think we talked about this in a previous episode, that it can take 2-3 years or even longer to completely do a thorough investigation. That's why the last 10-year full period that we have ends in 2021. So it's 2012 to 2021. And that's what we looked at. And then on top of it, we are going to specifically look at what we call as general aviation. These are primarily private small airplanes. These are not the big airliners and certainly not the military aircraft that we may read about in other places.
So even though we do see a lot of news coming out of the NTSB with airline crashes, and there are some of the incidents that we discussed in episode 1, this is a subset within aviation that still has a lot of aircraft activity, like we discussed, and unfortunately does actually have a higher percentage of accidents that do get reported. Is that correct?
Yeah, and sometimes people hear about these small planes crashes that happen, a plane skidded off the runway, etc. But we don't always hear the end of it because it just gets forgotten in the news cycle. So in this 10-year period that we looked at, there were approximately 12,400 accidents as characterized by the NTSB in the general aviation, this private small plane sector.
For that time period ending in 2021, like we mentioned, that sounds like a lot of crashes or a lot of accidents or mishaps.
It is, but what the NTSB does, and so does every other investigative body in the world, is that they divide that further into fatalities and non-fatal accidents. So fatalities means at least one fatality happened in that accident, and then everything else is non-fatal. That's how they characterize it. And I think that sort of makes sense.
So out of the 12,400 accidents, how many do you think involve fatalities? Let us know in the comments. Let us know what you've seen lately in the news, and give us your questions on general aviation accidents.
Later in the episode, we'll talk about what we found in the statistics, and there were maybe some surprises that you would want to stick around for. Now, let's keep going. Out of these fatalities, what do you think was the leading cause for it? We'd like to know your guess. So once again, go and write in the comments as to what you think is the most common reason for these fatalities.
And for those non-fatal accidents, where do you think those occurred in terms of phase of flight? During taxi, takeoff, en route to the destination, or landing? Let us know your guesses in the comments.
Yeah, later on in this episode, we're going to talk about all of these things, and we want to know whether or not what we found matched what you think they are, because certainly there were some surprises here. Isn't that, Elaine?
Definitely. There's always surprises when these reports come out. A lot of times these are things you don't expect, and what we find out we'll talk about later, and we'll discuss some ways of hopefully making sense of some of these.
And in this definition, the non-fatal, that means that somebody did not die, but it could involve serious injuries. It could involve big damage to the aircraft, maybe damage to the property, etc. That's how they classify it.
Definitely. They even at the NTSB classify the accidents by severity of injuries from none to minor to serious. And so it's definitely worth talking about some of the factors behind that and see what we can do in general aviation to address the safety record.
And we're going to look at the data later on in this episode. But the one thing that I really like what NTSB does, and other bodies throughout the world do this too, not only they analyze and investigate, but they also come up with a recommendation on how to improve. Because the reason we look at this is not to find out and say, hey, such and such happened, but how do we improve as an aviation community?
Definitely. And people in the general aviation community, pilots and non pilots, definitely make it a point to have discussions about accidents, because it's always something we can learn from. And it is always something where we can develop safe practices from. And by the way, the NTSB at all levels, from general aviation to the airlines, definitely comes out with recommendations for a lot of accidents where they see a need for an improvement somewhere, and we can all learn from that.
And that's what makes aviation safe in the future for everyone, both people who are flying the airplanes and people who are in the passenger seats. So, Elaine, we're going to start with the question number 3 first. The question was, for the non-fatal accident, what phase of flight do people think is the most critical? Where do these accidents happen most commonly?
Probably a common guess might be en route, because that is when the aircraft are highest, possibly going through weather, and possibly when there could be the most distractions or events in the cockpit that could cause a crash. Is that hot or cold?
That's not what the statistics show.
Okay.
The statistics, the NTSB 10-year statistic that we looked at, approximately 40%, 4 out of 10 accidents happen during the landing phase.
And that could be surprising to even people who fly, because we're still looking at some of the more sensational news about things that have happened on on the way before the landing. So, can you talk about what causes that many landing accidents in general aviation?
Yeah, exactly. So 40% happen during the landing. So why does it happen? The simplest thing is when you're landing a plane, and anybody who has either landed a plane or sat next to or even in the cabin while the plane is landing know that there's a lot of things going on, and it is very, very easy to get distracted and not do the right things during the landing. That's the simplest answer.
And just by the pure nature of the landing, you are actually pointed towards the ground, hitting lower and lower. And so that's where things can start moving a little too quickly, so to speak, or and one thing can go wrong and you're already close to the ground. So that's probably another cause, just by the situation that you do have to land.
Yeah. So, for example, if you happen to have a little bit excess airspeed upon landing, what do we think is going to happen?
Well, we're both flight instructors, so we know that that's a common error with pilots attempting to come in a little too fast. That tells me that you have a better chance of going off the runway after you land, possibly.
Yeah, exactly. So going off the runway because you're too fast and you can stop the airplane, that's common. So does what we call as like bouncing. We sometimes hear about this in news, is that you had that excess speed, so the plane tends to bounce on the runway. What happens if you bounce the runway? What is the most common thing happens to the airplane if you bounce it?
You bounce again, possibly you lose control. I know that that can really, really startle pilots when that happens. So if you are not using or not proficient at your recovery procedures, that could also end up in a hard landing. That's considered an accident or a runway excursion, because you've lost control on the ground.
Exactly. So if you catch it on time, you could correct it. And remember, in a previous episode, we talked about go around. So if you would just add power and and take off again, you're fine. But what happens is that if you force it, your landing gear could collapse, because the landing gears can only withstand so much force. So if you came in with extra force, extra speed, you could damage the landing gear. If the landing gear damages, your propeller could strike the runway, and that means that the engine could be faulty. There are a lot of things that can happen. So power plant issues, overrunning the runway, veering off the runway. These are all issues that happen during the landing, most often because you made a mistake even before you ever touch the ground. That's why go arounds are so important in our flight instruction.
And it sounds like that that can cause a lot more damage to the aircraft than the occupants would think. Can you talk about why there's more damage to the airplane and usually people are not injured or seriously injured during these?
Well, first of all, you're slower than you're up there and you're close to the ground. So if something happens, you're right there on the ground level. But ground contact is more common. So let's say if something happens at 4,000 feet, you're going to fall down and that could cause the airplane to disintegrate or hit other things and explode, etc. When you are 5 feet off the ground, it could be a hard landing and you could damage the airplane, but not necessarily. It's the difference between jumping off like a first story of a house versus a sixth story of a house. You're going to damage yourself and maybe hurt yourself or even kill yourself if you jump from higher up. It's the same kind of thing.
Sure, or it's like having an incident in a car. Car crashes, in terms of injuries to people inside, are all dependent on the speed you're going at when that happens. So it's the same thing with aircraft.
Yeah. So we talk about 40% of the accidents happening landing, but we can't forget the other 60%. So why don't we talk a little bit about what are these other phases and why we have to be equally vigilant in those phases?
So yeah, we have taxi and takeoff and en route as the other broad phases of flight, and the remainder of the accidents percentages seem to be fairly equally distributed among those three phases.
That's right. So just because landing is the most likely chance of an accident doesn't mean we can ignore everything else. And Elaine, I think my experience is people getting distracted, pilots getting distracted at the wrong time, focusing on the wrong things. I mean, as simple as I drop my pen and I end up bending to pick up the pen. In the meanwhile, I I touched something I shouldn't have, or I went somewhere I shouldn't have. Those are the kind of things that you don't think about, but those are more likely to cause an accident than some wing falling off your airplane. Sensational stuff that perhaps you hear about in the news.
Yeah, definitely. You've touched on probably one of the most biggest factors that are behind the incidents that cause a crash, aircraft damage, structural damage to an aircraft, and that is distraction. That can be the start of a whole chain of events that causes any number of incidents, accidents, and even on taxiing. So, even more so than landing, you're moving much more slowly taxiing. All the wheels are on the ground, but yet taxi accidents do happen. It's kind of like fender benders in your car where you accidentally run into a light pole or go over a berm because of distraction, and that's a pretty common cause of accidents while taxiing.
100%. And then we talked about in an episode about landing in big airports. When you land in big airports, you have to now watch for big jets that have big jet washes that could blow you away, crosswinds, ditches, snowbanks, other aircraft, other ground vehicles. We talked about some of these things. And so yes, accidents can happen in any phase, but it tend to happen more in the landing phase, like we said, 40% of the time. So I wonder if our viewers are surprised by this thing. If you are, and if this is different than what you guessed earlier, let us know.
So the nature of accidents changes a little bit with the takeoff and en route phases. Can you talk about takeoff? Do accidents happen during or right after takeoff, and what's the nature of those incidents?
Yeah, takeoff, a lot of things can happen because now you're transitioning from being a ground-borne vehicle to an airborne vehicle. This is where if engine malfunction happens, you really don't have any time to react because you're so low to the ground. So your options are limited. It's not that the risk of something happening is higher, but if something happens, your ability to recover from that is very, very low because you're just so low to the ground. You just don't have the options as opposed to being 5,000 feet up.
And meanwhile, you're actually going faster and going further from the ground, and so some of the risk aspects are a little more magnified than compared to landing, where you're decelerating.
Exactly. And that's why during our training phase, whether you're training from a private pilot or a commercial pilot, we focus on all these phases and acutely being aware of what the risks are and mitigating them in our training and in our practice.
And in general aviation, we do see accidents that happen during takeoff that involve a mechanical failure or a power failure to the engine soon after takeoff. And like you said, there's not much time to react. But can you touch on what pilots are trained to do in those critical few hundred feet when there may not be room to, let's say, turn around and land back at the airport?
Yeah, so the key here is when something happens, you do not want to be spending precious moment trying to think what you should do at that point. So all these things we pre-calculate. So we do something called takeoff briefing. I think we talked about this in an earlier episode. And you execute. If something happens, you already know the plan and you simply execute, whether it's immediately landing or finding a field and putting the plane safely on the ground, or making a U-turn and coming back if safely, you can do that. All those things, you have a plan, you just simply execute it. If you start thinking of the plan when this happens, it's way too late.
Definitely. I think takeoff briefings have become a little bit more common due to accidents that follow the same pattern, because it can be really dangerous to, for example, attempt to turn back to the runway you just took off if you are too low, losing airspeed because you need to keep under control to possibly maybe land in a field off the airport. And that doesn't sound like a good outcome, but that is actually part of the training, that you may just need to land somewhere other than the runway or the airport. And that's the safest way to address this.
Yeah, exactly. So if you know what can happen, you train for it. So when it does happen, you can immediately react. But thankfully, a vast majority of the accidents, remember we talked about the 12,400 in the 10-year period? A vast majority, in fact, almost 82% of the accidents happened as non-fatalities, which is a very good news. Hint, hint. What was the question? What's the percentage of fatal accidents?
So we have some surprising numbers here, with 82% of the accidents in the time period we looked at are non-fatal. That still leaves 18% with at least one fatality. And the root causes of that, you mentioned, possibly involve a lot of human error.
Yeah, it does. But the good news, Elaine, is that during the 10-year period that the NTSB looked at, in 2012, there were 1.3 fatalities per 100,000 hours, and that actually reduced to 1 per 100,000. So it is moving slowly, but at least seem to be moving in the right direction. So therefore, less fatalities per flight hours. That's a good thing.
That's definitely a good thing. And there are definitely improvements in technology and equipment that we've seen over the past number of years. So that has hopefully been contributing to a lower trend there as well. And in terms of the fatalities, like you mentioned, we would love it to be zero rather than one. And a lot of it is exploring some of the human and mechanical causes behind that. And a lot of that is due to external factors.
Yeah, so we asked the question earlier, in fact, early in the episode, as to what people thought was the reason for these fatal accidents. And why don't we tell them what these statistics are showing us?
So, in that block of time we looked at, I'm seeing here that about 43% of those accidents were due to loss of control in flight. That's been a big aviation term for years in discussing safety, but we probably want to explain a little bit about what loss of control in flight is. It's not just the airplane suddenly losing control.
No, certainly not. It's a little bit misleading. So the loss of control has nothing to do with the wings coming apart or the propeller falling off, although maybe rarely those do happen. But loss of control almost always is something that the pilot did or did not do at the right time. That's what happens, as in the pilot unknowingly or maybe knowingly without thinking about it, did something that put the plane in a weird situation that was difficult for them to recover from. That's what we mean by the term loss of control.
So the majority of these then start with the pilot, not the aircraft suddenly losing pieces or losing power or anything like that. Because even though that's extremely rare, then that can happen. A lot of it starts with another factor then.
Right. So out of this 43%, which is approximately 1,000 cases out of that 12,000 odd that we looked at tends to be, things like, for example, getting distracted. Very simple. Let's say you dropped a pen and you bent over to pick it up. And then in the meanwhile, you knock over something, and then that makes the plane do things that you're not supposed to. Maybe you turned off the autopilot. Maybe you did something you're not supposed to. Little things that you may not think about. Those are the things that's going to put you in loss of control. And when this happens, since you don't expect it, it startles you, and therefore you don't respond to it properly, at least not instantly.
Sure, and startle effect is also a common term where the brain might freeze for a few seconds while you try to discern what's going on, and in the meantime, something else could be happening. And usually, accidents are part of a chain. Correct? That one thing will lead to another, and so distraction is a pretty common factor.
Yeah, 100%. We talk about how, like a Swiss cheese model, if you will, right? I mean, it could be as simple as I took Sudafed in the morning and it made me drowsy. Maybe you don't think about it at all, but that may have led you to be slightly distracted, maybe more so than usual, causing that to happen. So it's always a cascading effect.
Definitely. And some of that can lead to impaired judgment, or some of that can lead to just not paying attention to what's going on in the environment, because, especially in the en route phase, weather is a big part of that Swiss cheese model, where maybe you got distracted and didn't check the weather as much as you should have, or you got distracted and you weren't checking the weather looking out ahead of you. So weather can be a big thing en route that can lead to that accident.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, even if you did check your weather, even if you knew what the forecast was, what actually happens may not match what the forecast is. And Elaine, I think one of the common ways pilots get into trouble, especially the newer pilots, visual pilots who have to see where they're going, what happens to them? They get into these situations like getting into the clouds that puts them into a position of getting disoriented.
Yes, unfortunately, that is a statistical cause of accident in very light aircraft, where you fly into the clouds accidentally because you didn't realize that they were going to be there. And pilots receive a little bit of minimal training starting out in flying through the clouds, but just enough to get out of them. And so, if you remain in that situation and you're not able to see, the brain literally does get oriented and disoriented, rather, and you don't know which way is up, and that is a very easy way to lose control of an aircraft.
Yeah, and that's why during training, even for a private pilot candidate that's starting from fresh, we we do exercises where we simulate the environment as if you're in a cloud and teach them how to get out of it. In most cases, I think we talked about in an earlier episode, is that when something happens, not compounding it by making more mistakes is the worst thing you can do. So you want to get out of it as gracefully as you can. So if you got into a cloud, get out of the cloud.
But even worse than clouds are turbulent clouds, or even worse, thunderstorms, and that has also been cited in the statistics as a cause that could have come about by inaccurate weather forecasts, inaccurate weather planning, or just simply getting too close to thunderstorms, which we all know what they look like by looking up at them. But when you're up in the air flying by them, it's pretty hard to judge whether you're getting too close to them or not, because that can cause a lot of issues like turbulence.
Yeah, exactly. But where people get into trouble, where most pilots get into trouble, even the experienced one, is that when situation is deteriorating ever so slowly and you just keep pushing on, and suddenly you're in a point of no return. Suddenly things are a lot worse than you started, even though just maybe 2 miles ago or 5 minutes ago, everything seemed okay. That's what people have to watch for.
Definitely. You touched on another big human element there with the pilots that could lead to mishaps. And that is, we call it in the aviation world, get their itis. That pilots are on a mission. They want to get from point A to point B. And sometimes when things start to get bad with the weather, or let's say you have a lower than expected fuel state, the tendency is to press on, to think, yes, I can make it there because I planned this out and it's going to work out. But unfortunately, if things do get worse and those things that are out of your control are not at all improving, that need to press on can lead to an accident.
Yeah, and here's the good news. Airplane technology is getting better. The planes are now much better in telling you where your fuel situation is, or how much turbulence you can take, or weather radars and color maps on where you're going. All those things are helping with the situational awareness. And then, Elaine, we also do a lot more training and self-awareness to be better pilots up there.
Definitely. Human factors is actually a training topic for pilots of all levels, whether you're starting out or you're in the advanced levels, because that is as we talked about, that's a constant element in all incidents and accidents. And so being self-aware of your own limitations as a human being and those reminders to double check things, to be more careful, and to try to avoid being distracted when you can, it all goes to help, and the technology certainly helps aid in that, because you mentioned things like having digital weather, digital fuel totalizers, that has actually gone a long ways to reduce a lot of those types of mishaps.
Yeah, not only that, now modern airplanes have parachutes built in. So if something
Some of them
happens, you
do.
can land. And they even have auto land that used to be a military thing, or like ejector seats and stuff like that. Now they have self emergency auto land in passenger airplanes. This is just, to me, is mind boggling, but a welcome change in the industry.
Wow, I've heard about that. It sounds really cool. That is coming to a small aircraft world, and I think it sounds like we might have to explore that as a future topic. So, Gopal, we talked about some of the accident statistics that we've seen in recent years, noted that that trend has started to come down a little bit, and some of the things that contribute to that. And we talked about some of the top few causes of incidents and accidents in different phases of flight. So I think people would like to know, well, how can we improve on that? And is flying in general aviation a safe thing, given all the numbers of accidents that you do point out?
Like we said before, anything over zero fatality is not a good thing. However, the good news is airplane technology is getting better day by day. Pilot training is getting day by day. Pilot awareness is getting day by day. Elaine, one of the reasons we do shows like this is to get people more aware, not to scare them, but to show that there are ways to learn from what happened so that we improve on the future.
And I think it's a constantly improving universe out there in terms of aviation safety.
Yes. And if you enjoy this episode, please like and share and subscribe to the channel and tell other people about it. And we have another episode following this one, and we're going to be talking about the fear of flying. We're going to address what are the reasons, why do people fear flying, and what ways we can address it. So make sure to join us next week on that.